Hello, everyone, and welcome to Biohackers Lab. I'm your host, Gary Kerwin, and on today's episode, I have Dr. Peter Brukner. Dr. Brukner is a world-renowned Australian sports medicine clinician and researcher. He is a professor of sports medicine at La Trobe University and has authored several books. This includes the textbook Brukner and Kahn's Clinical Sports Medicine, Australia's first sports medicine nutrition book called Food for Sport, and his most recent book called A Fat Lot of Good. Dr. Brukner has been the team doctor for multiple elite sports, including the Australian cricket team, Australian soccer team, Olympic team, Liverpool Football Club, and way more. Dr. Brukner, thanks so much for coming on to today.
Pleasure, Gary.
So, I just gave a very brief intro of your sporting background. I know you're not a newbie to the world of clinical sports medicine, are you?
No. I've been been battling away for 35 years or so in this game, and I've seen a sort of a huge transformation really in sports medicine in that time from being very much a sort of a lowly profession with not much sort of academic rigor or anything like that. Back in the 80s, and in that time, the profession's developed enormously, and it's probably for two reasons. One is obviously the demands of professional sport, but secondly, the increased amount of leisure and exercise that the people are doing, and they're getting injured and requiring help with that. So there's been a huge growth in that area, and in a number of countries now, in the UK and Australia, sports medicine is now recognised as a full medical specialty, the equivalent of any other specialty like cardiology or orthopedics or anything like that. And so that's been an interesting journey over that period of time. But it's been a great. I've been very fortunate. Timing is everything in life, and I think I got my sports medicine timing pretty right.
Mm-hmm. And, as you said, there's been such a great transition with that speciality, and that's why I'm hoping to try and get some of that knowledge out of you today, to just hear how you've transitioned in your own journey too, with your knowledge that you've gained over that time. And I think I'd like to start off with, because we're going to be speaking mainly about the low-carb diet for athletes and the pros and cons about it. So do you think most athletes, either recreational or elite, are eating too much sugar?
Yes. In a word, I think most people generally are eating too much sugar. That's the average Westerner, Australian, British, American is eating somewhere around 20 teaspoons of sugar a day, which is just crazy. The World Health Organization recommends ideally 6. So we're already way above that, and I think sugar and processed foods in general are the main reason really behind the sort of current epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes in particular, and they're massive problems. They're increasing at a rapid rate and have done for the last 30 or 40 years since we got obsessed about fat 40 years ago and forgot that it was actually sugar and processed carbohydrates that are the problem, not fat. But anyway, we're going to try and undo all that damage now and try and make sure the next generation don't have the same problem.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I want to get you on too, because to me it sounds like with that knowledge of understanding the impact of too many processed refined carbohydrates has had in general well-being. I also think, particularly in the athletic world, that's what a lot of athletes have been told to consume a lot of over the years. And we're going to get more into that detail now. But I think what would be interesting for people too, just listening to this, is a little bit of your background and why you became so passionate about the low-carb diet.
Well, I mean, I'd always been along with everyone else, really, been on the low-fat, bandwagon for the last 30 or 40 years. And I got to a point a few years ago, I just turned 60 years of age, which is the age that my father had developed type 2 diabetes, and I certainly didn't want to go down that track. And I became aware of this sort of this low-carb movement, or particularly through Tim Noakes, who was an old friend of mine, Tim, as many of the listeners would know, is a very esteemed sports scientist from South Africa who's challenged a lot of orthodoxies over the years. And he came out a few years ago and challenged the orthodoxy that carbohydrates were the best fuel for athletes and for people in general. And that was a big shock because he'd been a big proponent of carbohydrates. We'd all been, the sports nutrition mantra really had been, carbs, 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 really, as the best fuel for both for your health and for performance. And he came out and challenged that, and from his own experience and the experience of others, and said no, he was wrong. That it was actually carbs that were the problem, and that the low-fat movement was wrong. And I guess if anyone else had said it, I would have ignored it. But I've always been a big admirer of Tim's intellect, and he'd challenged previous orthodoxies and eventually been proven right. So it made me sort of at least sit up and take notice. And I read a book then by Gary Taubes called Good Calories, Bad Calories, and that was really the book that changed my life. I just couldn't believe what I was reading. And Gary Taubes is not a doctor; he's a journalist, science journalist. And he wrote this book and basically talked about carbs versus fats, and but in particular, sort of told the story of the political story, if you like, of how the low fat movement won out over the low carb movement way back in the 60s and 70s. And that was a fascinating and fairly frightening story, to be honest. And it turns out that the reason that low-fat movement won out had nothing to do with science, but everything to do with money and politics and agriculture and the US agriculture world. So I found the book really disturbing. I mean, every night I'd put it down. I'd sort of think to myself, "No, this couldn't be right. We couldn't have got something like this so wrong for so long." I mean, the whole of Western society has been on this sort of low fat experiment for 40 years, and it's been a disaster. We've just got fatter and sicker for 40 years, and yet we've just no one's thought about it, no one's challenged it. So all of a sudden there were some people saying, well, hang on, maybe we've got something wrong. I mean, if you had a business, that was results were getting steadily worse every year for 40 years, surely at some stage in that 40 years you'd sort of say to yourself, well, hang on a minute. Maybe we've got something wrong here. Maybe we're doing something wrong. But yet no one seems to have challenged that orthodoxy. There's just been this saying, they're not sticking to the diet. But the figures show that people have reduced their fat intake quite considerably over time, and they've maintained exercise, if not increased exercise. So it's really not what it appeared to be. Anyway, I've digressed from my own story. So I read this book, and then that really got me hooked, and I just started reading everything I could get my hands on, books and articles and so on. And in the last 6 years, I've probably spent 2 hours a day reading stuff, and I've read 100 books and a couple of thousand articles, and I got pretty much into it. But I decided, it was time for some research, and as you would know, Gary, I mean, research with an n equals 1 is basically regarded as a waste of time, except when the 1 is you, in which case it becomes very important. And so I did an n equals 1 research project, and went on day one, got all my bloods done, lipids and cholesterols and sugars and so on, and then went on a fairly strict low-carb, high-fat diet for 3 months, for 13 weeks. And and pasta, potatoes, and so on, and replace that with basically the way probably my grandparents would have eaten. Lots of food, bacon and eggs, and full fat dairy, lots of cream and butter, and so on, and plenty of green veg, and cut back on fruit. Just only had berries. So, and I started that, and the first thing I noticed was that instead of always being hungry, I was virtually never hungry. So my previous life, I'd have my cereal for breakfast, and then by sort of 10:30, I'd be looking at my watch saying, God, it must be lunchtime soon. And whereas now with eating a higher fat breakfast such as bacon and eggs, or full fat Greek yogurt with some nuts and berries, I just wasn't hungry all day, and I went to eating 2 meals a day. Enjoyed the meals, ate as much as I wanted to eat, and only needed to eat twice a day. So that was the first thing I noticed. And then I weighed myself weekly, and it just I lost a kilogram a week every single week. It was unbelievable. So I finished up in 13 weeks. I lost 13 kilograms, which just blew me away. I mean, I just couldn't believe it was so easy. And I was eating really well. I was enjoying what I was eating, and I kept losing weight. And it was just really bizarre because obviously the concept is you eat fat to lose fat, which is the exact opposite of everything we'd been taught. And that was the hardest thing, I think, just getting my head around the fact that it was okay to eat fat again. So it's been told for years it was bad, and trim the fat off your meat and low fat milk, low fat this and low fat that, which I'd adhere to religiously. With disastrous consequences, because I'd probably put on, half a kilogram a year for 30 years, just slowly putting on weight. And I was pre-diabetic. I had a fatty liver. I had a whole lot of health issues, although, to the outside and I ostensibly seemed healthy, but so then at the end of that 3 months, I redid my bloods and things had changed dramatically. My triglycerides, which were really high, came right down. My HDL went up. My fatty liver, I'd had a fatty liver. Now, this funny condition called fatty liver where you get fatty infiltrates in your liver tissue that's a precursor to diabetes. I'd had that for 10 years. Typical doctor, I'd completely ignored it in previous blood tests, but a number of blood tests had shown it. And in that 13-week period, it had completely resolved. It had gone from being quite abnormal at the start to absolutely normal, low normal, in fact, in 13 weeks, which is just amazing. And against everything that the medical profession teaches you. And the weird thing is, to get rid of a fatty liver, you need to eat fat. Well, the real thing is you need to stop eating sugar because it's fructose that gives you the fatty liver. So having cut out on sugar, I got rid of my fatty liver. I felt fantastic. I had so much more energy. I wasn't falling asleep in the afternoon. My exercise capacity increased. There was one negative, though. I had to get a new wardrobe because I'd dropped 2 sizes in my clothes and they were all swimming on me. But that was a small price to pay. So really, I was absolutely convinced at that time. And since then, I've become a passionate advocate of this way of living and trying to sort of overcome the sort of myths of the last 30 or 40 years that fat is the problem. Whereas quite clearly, there's so much evidence now that it's sugar, processed foods, and vegetable oils. They're the things that are causing our epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes. It's nothing to do with fat. Yes, there are good fats and bad fats, but we've had it the wrong way around. Saturated fats, the animal fats are okay, and it's the polyunsaturated oils that are the problem. But it's very hard getting that message across, I'm afraid, Gary. But we've just got to keep chipping away. And there are powerful people who want to maintain the status quo, obviously.
Yeah. Well, as you said, whenever you try something yourself, that's when I think you do a lot of learning because you are your own chemistry experiment. So you get to see that is a theory reality. And I think that one point you mentioned there about the fatty liver disease, I had a chance to go to the public health collaboration as you did because you were a speaker there in London recently. And that was something very interesting I discovered too, as you've just mentioned, is that we could use a fatty liver marker as a precursor that you're metabolically not good and that you may be going on that path to diabetes. And as you said, I mean, in 13 weeks, you had resolved something that was coming up abnormal for 10 years. That's incredible.
Yes, I mean, the figures tell us that a third of adults in Britain and Australia have fatty liver disease. Most people don't know it. You only find out either by a blood test or a liver scan. But it's just a silent disease that is associated with diabetes, and it's a high incidence of people who have fatty liver eventually going on to develop diabetes. And the common denominator there is probably the amount of fructose and sugar that is being eaten. Fatty liver seems to be specifically related to fructose, and as most people would know, fructose is half of what we commonly call table sugar. It's a mixture of fructose and glucose, which makes sucrose, which is table sugar. So, eating, and there's a lot of fructose in fruits in particular. So sort of soft drinks and fruit juices are full of fructose, and so that's the reason we've got such a high incidence of fatty liver. And to be honest, I couldn't believe the blood results. It was just, I actually had to repeat them a few weeks later because I was really very skeptical. But they were absolutely normal the next time too. So it's hard to believe that you could just solve a problem like that so simply by changing your diet.
Yeah. And this gets me thinking too about coming back to athletes and people who are trying to perform, that, they may be eating granolas and, low-fat yogurts and lots of fruit in the morning or something. And coming back to the original question, I was thinking too, do they get exposed to many sugars in a sense? And I'd just be interested, have you come across where athletes have do they have the same rate of fatty liver, or they don't get fatty liver? I don't know. Is there anything in that world?
No,
do you know?
I think they do. I think I have a real concern that we've had a generation of athletes who have had incredibly high sugar and carbohydrate intakes, for their sports drinks and gels and pasta parties and everything. And we've been encouraged athletes to have very high carbohydrate intakes, and which is certainly carbohydrates. Don't get me wrong, carbohydrates are a very effective fuel for athletes. There's no doubt about that. But there's a couple of problems with carbohydrates as a fuel. One is as you mentioned, what is the long-term effect of having very high dosages of carbohydrates on insulin resistance, on fatty liver, on eventually developing diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And I think that's a real concern with such high doses of carbohydrate. The other problem for athletes with carbohydrate is that we have a very limited store of carbohydrates. We can really only store enough carbohydrates for a couple of hours of activity. And so, that infamous wall that you hit in the marathon after about 2 hours is when you run out of your carbohydrate stores, or your glycogen, as we call the storage form of carbohydrate. So you constantly have to replenish supplies, which can be very challenging sometimes. Endurance and ultra endurance events, you always have to top up with gels and bananas and so on. So there are a couple of problems as a result of all of that. The issue with fat as a fuel for athletes is very interesting. One of the advantages of fat is that, unlike carbohydrate, you have almost unlimited supply of fat. Even the skinniest person has more than enough fat to sustain them for long periods of exercise. So you don't need to replenish your supplies of fat. In fact, you can, if you're on a very sort of high fat, low carb diet, you don't really even need to eat before it. I've known plenty of people who run a marathon without even having breakfast. They're just running off their fat supplies once your body is used to doing that. The negative about so in other words, why wouldn't everyone use fat primarily as their fuel for athletic endeavor? Because A, it's probably healthier, and B, you've got unlimited supplies. The problem with fat as a fuel is at high intensity, that when you are exercising at a relatively high intensity, so above 60 or 70% of your VO2 max, you probably do need some carbohydrates because the fat is not sufficient for most people to provide the amount of energy that's required for high intensity exercise. So often someone on basically who's running on fats will tell you that for their bike ride or whatever it might be, that they were fine, but then when they had to climb a hill or sprint, they just didn't quite have that extra gear that they might have on carbs. So I think the situation with fueling for athletic performance is still quite fluid, if you'll excuse the expression. I mean, I think we're going through a transition from being totally carbohydrate obsessed and carbohydrate dominant to a group of people saying no, that's completely wrong. You should only be running off fat. To a sort of a hybrid model now where it really depends on the amount of exercise and the intensity of exercise that you're doing as to what is the best fuel. I would still argue that primarily, athletes should be on a low-carb, high-fat diet most of the time. I think, for the health reasons that we've talked about, but there are also a number of other reasons for, or other advantages to reducing carbs as an athlete. One is recovery. You do seem to have a lot less muscle damage. So we know that sugar in particular is quite a pro-inflammatory substance, and you get increased inflammation as a result of a high sort of a sugar intake. And if you reduce that, it does seem to reduce the amount of muscle damage that occurs, and even the amount of inflammation. A lot of athletes have an inflamed, Achilles tendon or something like that. I know myself, I'd always had a problem with my Achilles. And I remember thinking about 6 weeks into this diet that, that's funny, I haven't felt my Achilles recently. And I felt down it for the first time ever. It wasn't tender. So a number of people will tell you that their inflammation, arthritis or whatever, feels a lot better without that sort of inflammatory carbohydrates. So there's that aspect of it, as well as the sort of overall health benefits, plus the unlimited amount of fuel, plus the, as I said, the reduction in inflammation and the improved recovery after exercise. So there are certainly advantages to having high fat. What a number of the sports dietitians are suggesting now, which I think makes a lot of sense, is sort of a hybrid model of train low, compete high. So basically, while you're training, you maintain a low carbohydrate intake, and then you encourage your fat oxidation, so you become basically a fat-fueled athlete. And then on days of particularly hard training or on competition days, you top up with some carbohydrates probably the night before. Not a massive amount. You don't have to go crazy on the pasta party, but a moderate amount of carbohydrates on the night before on the day of exercise to give you that extra sort of burst of energy that you need. But it's still, we're still unclear exactly what the best regime is, but that seems to be the way endurance athletes are going at the moment. But I think for the average recreational athlete, they're fine on low carb, high fat diet, and you get all the health benefits as well. So I hope it makes some sense. I know it's a very confusing area. A lot of debate, a very fierce debate in sort of the team carbs and fat, and like most things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a whole new area, as you said. The mantra has been about the carb loading for years for athletes, and now we're in that transition stage. And I like that idea of the hybrid model too, and how we're trying to figure out which sports are going to benefit more from which scenario. So it's.
If I can jump in there, Gary. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, certainly the purely endurance sport. So, let's say people doing, crazy stuff, 100-mile runs or, Ironman triathletes and so on, which is never going to really require, except at the very elite level, maybe, a high intensity. I think they do very well on a low carb, high fat diet. There's no doubt about that. Then those who are in very high intensity sports probably need carbs. The interesting challenge is the ones in the middle, really, who are playing, the various football codes or basketball or something, which has bursts of high intensity activity, woven into basically, quite a lot of endurance as well, and so on. So they're the interesting group that probably benefit most from this hybrid. But I think there's a lot of individual variation as well. I think some people seem to be fine. I mean, I know quite a very elite footballers who don't need any carbs at all, who do very well on a low-carb, high-fat diet and seem to still be able to do high-intensity performance without any problems. Whereas there are others who, as I mentioned before, just need that extra carbs to sort of top them up on game day and so on. So I think it's a little bit of trial and error. I think it's a little bit a matter of experimenting and seeing what's right for you, for each individual. And because I think generally, we all have dependent on a whole lot of things, probably a degree of insulin resistance largely. We have a sort of an ideal amount of carbs we all should be eating. I think for the very insulin-resistant, type 2 diabetic, pre-diabetic, metabolic syndrome, grossly obese, whatever, that's probably pretty low. It's they would benefit from very low carb or even a ketogenic diet. Whereas those who are, basically insulin sensitive, pretty skinny, metabolically healthy, they can certainly do, tolerate a reasonable level of carbs, probably nowhere near the sort of, 200 or 300 grams of carbs a day that the average Westerner has, but 150 grams of carbs is okay for them. So there's really no, there's no one diet for every person. There's no one amount of carbs for every person. It just depends on your metabolic health, really. And if you're metabolically healthy, you can cope reasonably well. But you still don't want to go too high because you'll soon be metabolically unhealthy.
Yeah, and I guess is that something maybe you've seen, or I know that even Professor Tim Noakes has talked about that, where you can't outrun a bad diet in a way. So in this sense, what I'm talking about is that you may have been consuming X amount of carbohydrates or processed foods and thinking, no, but I exercise at a very high intensity, but that doesn't protect you from metabolic conditions later on, even if you keep at that same intensity, does it?
Well, that's right. I think I think that's a very good expression. You can't outrun a bad diet, because so many people, you see them feeding their face with all sorts of junk food or beer or whatever in the night, and they say, "Oh, it's okay. I'm going for a run in the morning." Well, it's not. It's not that simple for two reasons. One is the sort of this calories in, calories out stuff is a load of nonsense, really. I mean, it's it's the type of calorie that's important, as much as the amount of calorie. You can't tell me that 400 calories of salmon is the same as 4 calories of ice cream. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. Because the body responds differently to different nutrients. So that's one significant problem with that. And then the other thing, as you mentioned, is the metabolic effect of these high calorie intake diets or high carbohydrate intake as well. So they've got the potential to cause problems. So it's it's not just a matter of. I mean, exercise is important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not downplaying the role of exercise. Exercise, has massive benefits for people in all sorts of medical conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc., etc. It's incredibly important. I put it on a par with diet as the two most important factors in the prevention of chronic disease. But specifically for weight loss, it's probably not as important. Well, certainly not as important as diet. Diet is really the key to weight loss. I sort of look at it as probably 80% diet, 20% exercise. That's very unscientific, but that's just my gut sort of feel of the importance. But exercise is important for a whole lot of other reasons as well. But diet is certainly the key to weight loss and to metabolic health, and we've got it wrong, and we've got to change, because we're just getting sicker and fatter, and it's not good. And we need to challenge the paradigm, the existing paradigm, and make some changes, because before it's too late. They're saying that diabetes alone will bankrupt the NHS, at the moment. I mean, it's just such a costly disease with so many complications of cardiovascular and vascular problems and kidney problems and eye problems. And there's so many problems related to diabetes. And we just have this epidemic of diabetes. And yet we know, recently that it's preventable and reversible with a low carb diet, and but we just got to get that message out there. And I think places like diabetes.co.uk are playing an incredibly valuable role in educating people on the importance of a low carb diet. It just doesn't make any sense when diabetes is a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. So basically, it's like alcoholism. You can't tolerate alcohol. Well, this is you can't tolerate carbohydrate, and yet for years we were so obsessed with fat that we've recommended a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet for diabetics. It just does not make any sense at all. And we see once we cut down carbs to a low amount, we have dramatic improvements in diabetic control and even reversing people's type 2 diabetes. So it's it's so important that we get that message across.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also interested, do you think there's a difference when it comes to age too? So a sports person who's a teenager or in the early 20s, do they need more carbohydrates, or and as maybe once we get into our 30s and our 40s or older, that's where I'm seeing like some pro athletes find that no, I need to back off the carbs because I'm gaining weight, or as you said, inflamed, and I've got this chronic pain that just won't go away. Is there any subtle difference, do you think, from an age point of view when it comes to performance and diet?
Well, I think indirectly, because I think as you get older, especially when you're exposed to a high sugar, high carbohydrate intake, you become more insulin resistant, and as you become more insulin resistant, the effect of carbohydrates are even worse, and that's when you start putting on the weight and so on. It's amazing, Gary, how many sort of elite athletes are overweight. They're obviously not grossly overweight, but they're 2, 3, 4 kilograms over their ideal weight, despite almost full-time exercise. And that's because of their diet. And when we put these elite athletes on a low carb, healthy fat diet, they drop 2 or 3 kilograms almost straight away without losing any muscle, and feel fantastic and improve their power to weight ratio. And so it really shows that no matter how much exercise you do, you still have to eat properly if you want to maintain a good weight. But I think that's very true about it's not just athletes who get worse as they get older. I think when you're sort of a teenager, generally you're pretty insulin sensitive and you're fine. But over a period of time, that might be 10, 20, 30 years, depending on the amount of carbohydrate you're exposed to, and depending on your genetics too. There's also a big genetic factor in all this. You gradually become more and more resistant to the effects of insulin. Therefore, you have to produce more and more insulin, and insulin is a fat storage hormone. So it's not surprising that as you get older, you get there's a tendency to put on weight, and there's a very good reason for that. And as I said earlier, my concern is that elite athletes in particular are having such high carbohydrate doses, they may be even more at risk of developing insulin resistance and all the problems associated with that than the average population. So, I have a real concern about that.
And, we're talking about insulin. In the athletic world, a lot of people need it for muscle growth too. And so from what I understand, say after a heavy resistance training workout, that you might eat something more carbohydrates or sugary to raise your insulin, to get insulin to assist muscle growth. And you were talking earlier about muscle recovery and how a more low carb, healthy fat, high fat way of eating actually assists recovery. Is there any sort of new thinking or different way that elite athletes are eating after an event? So I'm thinking footballers who've just gone really hard for a final somewhere, or they're a semi-final and they've got into the finals. Do they eat a certain way now after so that they recover faster?
Well, I think the emphasis has always been largely on protein after protein shakes and so on. And with probably some carbohydrates, but relatively low levels of carbohydrate, probably just sufficient to replenish any glycogen and maybe muscle glycogen that's used. But it depends a little bit on what regime you're on. I mean, if you're on a low carb, generally on a low carb, high fat program, you probably don't need to replenish your carbs as much after exercise. So and insulin was still being produced. I mean, you're never on no insulin. You're certainly enough insulin there to promote muscle growth. But it's interesting. Resistance athletes have always been, similar to endurance, have been sort of high carb, high protein. But I think they're also realizing that they hate body fat. Of course, whether it's whether you're a bodybuilder or a weightlifter or whatever, you want to increase your power to weight ratio. So if you can reduce your body fat by reducing your carb intake without losing muscle mass, which provided you have sufficient protein, you'll maintain your muscle mass. You're going to improve your power to weight ratio. So a lot of resistance athletes and those who want to keep at a low weight, or even gymnasts who are obviously very concerned about their weight and their power to weight ratio, are now switching towards more of a lower carb, higher fat diet. So it's been a very interesting change.
Mm. And I'd like to ask you about skin folds. So I've got a copy of your book, which I managed to pick up at the conference, so anyone watching the YouTube video can see it. And in there, Shane Watson, the cricketer, was talking about skin folds and saying that there was a difference when he converted across to a low-carb diet. Is that what is skin fold testing used for at an elite level, and how are they measured, the athletes, in that sense?
Yeah, well, skin folds are a very popular thing done in all sort of professional sporting teams. People's skin folds are measured. There are various ways of measuring your muscle, your amount of body fat, really. They go from basic levels, like jumping on the scales, to very sophisticated methods with DEXA scanning and things like that, where you can exact measurements of body fat and muscle and all sorts of things. So one of the ways in which sort of halfway between those in its complexity, if you like, is measuring skin folds. And what they do there is that there are a number of sites around the body, standard sites that you use. You use a pair of calipers and you measure. You sort of grab a handful of skin with the underlying cutaneous fat, and you measure the thickness of that with these calipers, and then you add the sum of those 7 or 8 skin fold sites, and you come up with a figure. And you can. There are 2 aspects to that. One, the figure can be compared to the average for your sport, or what the coach would like you to. The coach might say, "Well, we want everyone to have skin folds under 60 or whatever." And secondly, you can also measure it to your previous and your next measurement, so to see whether you're going up or down as far as. So it's a more accurate measure of body fat than just jumping on the scales, but a less accurate measure than a DEXA scan or something like that. But very popular at sporting clubs. Any Premier League football club would regularly measure people's skin folds, for instance, just to monitor their progress, monitor their training. If their skin folds are increasing, you'd be concerned as to, are they, what are they eating? It's an opportunity to sort of monitor what they're doing. If they're dropping skin, but generally, the player will come in to pre-season maybe a little bit underdone. They had a good feel their recommended diet and then doing less exercise, and so they might have the skin folds might be up a bit, and then you see them come down with the intensity of pre-season training and so on. So it's a very popular way of monitoring your body fat levels.
Yeah, and as Shane said, he noticed when he went low carb that it got better. That his skin, he was always in sort of the worst category for the cricket team, was he?
Dan had always struggled with his weight, and he says he was always hungry. That was part of the problem, and that when he would starve himself, the only way he could lose weight was to starve himself. And he struggled with energy levels. He was also grumpy and miserable, and so on. So going low carb completely transformed things. He could eat whatever he's got a massive appetite, whatever he could eat, whatever he wanted to eat, and within reason. And he would still drop weight, and it made a big difference to his both weight, and also he had a lot of problems with injuries over his career, and I think he'd be the first to say that his injury problems have lessened since he's been on this diet. So yes, he's recently performed magnificently in the IPL final in India, and hit the highest score ever in an IPL final at the age of 36. So he must be doing something right.
Yeah, and so it sounds like a long duration sport like cricket, or even in IPL for anyone in America if they don't realize what that means. It's the Indian Premier League for cricket. It's a very fast form of cricket, 2020 cricket, isn't it? Yeah, and so that's more. Yeah, it's where you're going to be smacking the ball as hard as you can, or bowling really fast quite often, and running around a lot. But it sounds like, a low carbohydrate diet, you would say for any aspiring cricketers, that is a good choice for the long term of your career, for both performance on the day, but so that you can keep playing for as long as possible too.
Yeah, I think so. I'd be advising any aspiring young sports person in any sport really to just be be careful about their level of carbohydrate intake, because I think that that can be a real issue. Obviously, we've had this tradition of athletes being encouraged to have the sports drinks and gels and so on, and I'm not sure that they're in the long term that's doing them a lot of good. And I think we're slowly seeing a shift away from that sort of way of eating. And I think over the next few years we're going to see more and more emphasis on fat and fat as a fuel rather than carbohydrate.
So at the moment now, you're not such a fan of sports drinks for different types of sports. You prefer if the athlete was drinking water or like a salt water mixture? Any preference?
Yeah, I think a watering. Basically, most people are fine on just water. I think if you're a heavy sweater or you're doing a lot of exercise in hot weather and you're sweating a lot, you probably need some electrolytes, some sodium, one of the electrolyte mixes maybe, some sodium, some potassium to be replenished. But by and large, I'm not a big fan of sports drinks, and I think water and electrolytes are probably the best fuel for pretty much all exercise. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to find out. We talked earlier about certain bodies that might be influencing the nutrition world, but it must be very prevalent in elite teams too, because a lot of athletes are sponsored by different companies. And so are they how are they finding that, where if they maybe want to adopt a low carbohydrate diet but they're a face for a certain company, or do those companies also have influence over the nutrition that is in the athlete's canteen?
Well, I think they're certainly always they're always available. The sponsors drinks are always available. It doesn't necessarily mean that the athletes always use them. They obviously don't publicize that, but I think a lot of the time athletes do drink water rather than a sponsored sports drink, and I think that happens a lot behind the scenes. I think the sports drinks are good for shower-winning coaches, when they give them the Gatorade shower or something, but I'm not sure that they're quite as good for fueling the athletes in the meantime. But to be fair, some of the sports drinks companies have produced lower sugar versions of their product, and they're becoming more and more popular. Those reduced sugar ones, and I think that's going to be the trend in both sports drinks and soft drinks, that the commercial organisations realise that there's demand for lower or even no sugar products, and you certainly see that with the Coca-Colas of this world at the moment. There's a big trend away from full strength Coke towards the Diet Cokes, or even towards bottled water. So I think that's a great sign that people are starting to realise that excessive sugar intake is not healthy.
Mm-hmm. And when we were talking about with low carbohydrate diets, and we talked about performance and strength ratios, but I know when people go through the transition phase, sometimes they might be more prone to cramping. That's more in the ketogenic type of scenario. But is that something you've also noticed with athletes who go low carb, that they have to? They're more predisposed to cramping in the beginning, and it takes a while to get over that.
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. We certainly do have the impression that there's more cramping in low carb. I think there are two potential with that. One is salt. When you don't eat any processed foods, your salt intake is quite low because there's just no salt around. So when you're eating real food, sort of low carb diet, you probably need to add salt to your food and be a little bit careful about your salt intake because it's very low without processed food. So I actually liberally sprinkle salt on my food quite a bit. I even add a few quirky habits. I add salt to my green tea and to my bone broth and things. So I'm pretty keen to get my salt up, and I find also I do cramp. And the other is magnesium. There's significant problems with low magnesium. It's in our soils and so on. So I think there's a potential there for magnesium to be an issue. So if people are cramping, I encourage them to increase their salt intake and to consider taking a magnesium supplement for a little while till they get on top of that problem. But yes, that is certainly one of the side effects of a low carb, high fat diet that some people experience. The other side effect that people talk about is this sort of thing called keto flu. That when you go sort of quite low carb initially for maybe at some stage in the first 2 or 3 weeks, you don't feel so good, and you get sort of flu-like symptoms and so on. And that's something that's temporary. It passes as long as you realise that that's what's going on and just get through it. Then that passes relatively quickly, but it can be a little bit off-putting for people. They say, "Oh, well, this is I felt terrible on low carb," because once you get over that, you feel fantastic. So it's something to be careful of.
And I guess coming to the end of our conversation here, I'd be interested to know how is this being introduced, like the low carbohydrate, into elite teams? Is it more as an individual, or are the sort of the sports nutritionists or the dietitians who manage the food, like the canteen selection, are they interested in the low carbohydrate diet for their teams, or is it someone like yourself as the team medical doctor that has a discussion with the sports dietitian who's managing the food choice for the athletes, that you two come together to go, right, let's try this out for the team?
Well, that's the ideal scenario. I think there's a lot of variation, really. I think some dietitians are still sticking to the old mantra and are reluctant to sort of embrace this new philosophy. I think a lot of it is driven by the athletes themselves and also by the fitness staff and sports science staff. I know, for instance, there are a number of the top Premier League clubs who have embraced this sort of lower carb, higher fat way of eating, and they've gone to the hybrid approach where by and large during the week they're low carb, and they encourage low carb eating, low carb high fat eating in their canteens and for breakfast and lunch and so on. And then depending on individual responses, they'll top up with some moderate amount of carbs on the night before a game or something like that. So that's become more and more part of elite sport, I think, and as I said, a number of back in Australia, a number of the AFL teams have done this, and I know in the UK, a number of I have a consultant's role in a couple of the top UK Premier League clubs, and they're both sort of this lower carb, high fat eating. So I think it's it's going to be the sort of way of sport in the future. I'm certainly not suggesting that we ditch carbs completely. They're still a very important fuel, but it's more a balance, I think, between day-to-day running off fat and then occasionally needing your carbs for the high-intensity work.
And that's the biggest message I'm getting from our talk today, is this hybrid model of saying, as a baseline, low carbohydrates is a sustainable diet, and it's a good choice for long-term metabolic health. And depending on your sport and your needs and your genetics and your own personal physiology, that there'll be times when you need to do the top up, as you mentioned with the Premier League teams, the football teams. But then there's certain sports where you'll benefit more from just staying low carbohydrate too. It just depends on your scenario. So it's been fascinating to hear all of these different points. I know you've
summed it up better, Gary. You did a great job of summing.
No problems. That's how you sum up 60 minutes in just a little soundbite. This is another monster. I mean, your book is a nice thick chunk of just good reading, and I just want to bring it up because, I know we've talked a lot about sports medicine and science, but I believe, like, if you're an athlete, this is a great book to read, but just generally too, if you want to take good care of your health and you're interested in the low carbohydrate diet. And you're also you're doing a sugar by half campaign. If you could just give a little summary of what that means.
Yeah, that's a campaign we've got going in Australia, and with under the premise that sugar is the number one enemy. I mean, it's not the only problem, but it's a big part of the problem. And so we thought, well, instead of just sort of tackling everything, we'd just sort of tackle the sugar. And so we've started a national campaign in Australia called Sugar by Half, which is with the aim to reduce the amount of added sugar by a half. So the average Australian has somewhere, 15 to 20 teaspoons of sugar a day. And we want to get that down, to under 10 certainly, and ideally down to the World Health ideal amount of 6. So we figure if we can reduce the amount of added sugar intake by a half, it would have a massive impact on the health of people in Australia and everywhere really. So it's just in Australia at the moment, but I've actually just had an approach from someone in the US to maybe expand the campaign over there. But it's just a philosophy anyway that we need to reduce the amount of sugar for our metabolic health. I think is the important thing. But as you say, the book is basically that everything I've learned, I guess, in the last 5 or 6 years while I've been researching this. I just thought I'd put it all down in one place, and people seem to find it interesting and useful. So I've also got a new website, fatlotofgood.com.au. That will have my sort of regular blogs and whole heap of information that's in the book, and additional information to what's in the book. So that's fatlotofgood.com.au.
And if anyone also wants to keep up with you other than that website, do you have a preference for a particular social media account or something that for anyone to follow you, or where you share your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'm a Twitter. I do a little bit of stuff on Twitter. It's just at Peter Brukner, Brukner. And for some reason, a few people seem to follow me, so I put out a few bits and pieces. So that's fine. So for people outside, if people want to get my book, Fat Lot of Good, I think probably Book Depository is the best place outside Australia. To get it, they'll send it with free shipping. So if you get onto the Book Depository website, that's probably the way to go. So good luck with it.
And I'll put a link to all of these in the show notes in the description area, either on your episode page for anyone listening to this. Peter, I just want to say thank you again for sharing all that knowledge. I mean, I've tried to take 35 years of sports medicine knowledge and just try glean some of it in the 60 minutes, and there would be so much more to pull out. But I think there's so much actionable information you've already given athletes and just general people about a good way of eating for performance and muscle health. So thank you so much for sharing that.
No, it's been a pleasure, Gary.